Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Ladan Neurotech.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Really excited. We're going to be starting another regularly scheduled programming with Loup Ventures, Avery Bedows, and Doug Clinton, former guests on the show and good friends. And we're going to be kind of talking about an investment roundup in the neurotech world. So I'm really excited about doing this. We're probably going to be doing this about quarterly, every 3 months, something like this, and see what they're looking at, see what they're interested in. But we talk about the news over the last few months. So guys, welcome on the show. And first things first, we got to talk about CTRL-labs.
Alrighty. Well, Ladan, first of all, thanks for having us on here. The Neural Implant Podcast has a special place in my heart. I think I've told you this before, but when I originally got into Neurotech, the very first thing I did was binge listen to 35 episodes of this podcast. So there's some special significance for me.
I remember that. You also said you're taking notes, like 1 page of notes on every...
Oh, I still have a very long note in my iPhone Notes app with notes about this. I remember, I think the first... the one that's seared in my memory the most was your episode with Walter Voigt about his interfaces that would adjust their flexibility after they've been implanted. That, I don't know why that stuck with me, but yeah, I do have those notes.
Yeah, so guys, let's talk about CTRL-labs. Facebook recently acquired CTRL-labs, which is kind of a myoelectric device, basically measuring the signals going through the arm. So essentially you could type in the air, and the idea would be that you could have a virtual keyboard in the air. And so, yeah, Facebook acquired these guys for $500 million, which for those of you guys who don't know is a lot of money. Yeah, what do you guys think about that?
I don't know, Rada. It might have even been $1 billion. We got a range. We got a 500 to $1 billion range. So somewhere in there. Yeah, it was reported as being somewhere in that range. Unclear where it falls in that range, but suffice to say that all of that counts as quite a nice exit for the company. It was a company that when they first put out their initial public-facing materials, probably 12 to 18 months ago, I was really excited about it. It looked super cool. I think the most important thing to understand about this acquisition, at least the way that I look at it, is at the end of the day, it's not about the brain technology. To me, as someone who worked previously in VR and spent a ton of time thinking about how to interact with virtual or augmented reality environments and had to develop in Unity using the 6th degree of freedom controllers, tracked hand controllers for the HTC Vive, and build a fairly complicated interface around it. It was extremely evident to me that, at least insofar as input into a computer system is concerned, using your hands with high fidelity is the thing that has been stopping VR from taking off, and in AR as well. And the reason is, if you think about how we use our computers today, most of our applications, particularly intense productivity applications, so you go Gmail, you could go iCal on the low end. On the high end, you have your Photoshop, you have your Ableton, Illustrator, any professional toolkit. And the interactions are extremely complex, and we are using the 10 degrees of freedom of our fingers to manipulate I'm not going to go and count the number of keys on my keyboard right now, but many keys plus the mouse. And that was just infeasible with VR. And so you had a very limited set of applications, and you'd have to spend a ton of time basically being clever interface designers to try and give people meaningful control over the environment, despite the fact that the modalities of interaction were very limited. And so what I see the CTRL-labs acquisition is I see this as Facebook basically finally doing what they need to do to put together a full-blown augmented reality system, because it wasn't going to happen without high fidelity hand tracking.
So this wasn't a Neurotech play. This was a VR play. And so they're not really interested in furthering BCIs, brain computer interfaces, more their side of the virtual reality.
Well, I don't know if that's true. Like, there's been a lot of stuff in the media about Facebook's building ape. So they're doing some BCI work. And I think they had a post online about this pretty recently. But I don't see CTRL-labs as the product as furthering their BCI efforts. I think that maybe from a talent perspective, it does. I mean, CTRL-labs, they have tens of employees. I don't know how many. And some large fraction of those employees are very highly technically trained. Probably a lot of machine learning folks who have now kind of dived into computational neuroscience or applied deep learning to this. That obviously, that talent is going to be able to translate across any kind of biosignal that Facebook wants to work with. So I suppose you could consider this a BCI's investment in that regard. But if I had to guess, sitting in the boardroom at Facebook, I mean, sure, bringing interfaces are coming up in the conversation, but I bet the majority of the conversation was focused around how this fits strategically into the ability to like fully leverage an augmented reality experience.
I would add too that the way that I would almost think about it is take out the words brain control and just use interface in terms of the reason for the bet. And I think what it is though is if you think about Facebook's sort of history in acquisition and interfaces, right? The bet that they made on Oculus. I think they saw that, they thought that it seemed crazy at the time. Maybe even today, you might say that acquisition hasn't worked out, hasn't been profitable yet. But I think it's a very, very long-term play in terms of how they think about where people will be interfacing with computers and with one another in the future. And I think that, to Avery's point, CTRL-labs fits in as a piece to this sort of interface of the future question. And I think the reason why the interface of the future is so important is if you think about, Microsoft, I think arguably won, even though they weren't providing hardware, kind of the interface layer for the PC. I think Apple, and to a lesser extent, Google with Android, kind of won the interface layer with mobile. When you own that layer, there's so much value that you can sort of accrue by being the gateway and then providing a platform for other people to build on top of it. And I think that's really what the acquisition is about.
Yeah, I regularly talk to people who describe Neurotech as a platform, and I just fundamentally disagree with that because with a platform, at least in the way that we conceive of the desktop computer as a platform and the mobile phone as a platform and AR/VR as a platform, you need some kind of like very high bandwidth, high specificity display technology. What was limiting the full, platformship of AR/VR was, as Doug's been saying, this interface component. Once you have the interface component, then you own this platform. And so perhaps yet third way to describe this acquisition is this acquisition was the reification of Facebook's AR/VR efforts as a platform because it inducted the interface or the input into the loop, which then enables the full platform.
So yeah, that was my feelings kind of going into or seeing the news, like boom, it pops up and I'm like, wow, this seems very, very overpriced, overvalued. But you guys are saying it's kind of more of a Microsoft approach. Like this is going to be huge. This is going to be like our entrance into VR. So you guys would argue maybe it wasn't overvalued?
I don't even know how to begin thinking about the value. I mean, CTRL-labs raised a lot of money on.
Wait! Isn't that your job as investors, as a venture capital? Don't you have to always be looking at value?
I'm sure you have to always be looking at value, but I think it gets challenging to value when the company has either zero or minimal revenue. Like this reminds me a little bit of the Google DeepMind acquisition. Doug, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if there's a standard way to value R&D efforts. I mean, you could probably assign a dollar sign to talent and you could assign a dollar sign to IP, but it's not like there's actual revenue and profit to look at and to determine a multiple.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that sort of the idea of value can become very abstract when it's a corporate acquisition. So value, if you think about the value of something in like a public market context, that is typically going to be based on some expectation of future revenue and earnings, right? It's sort of cash flow based and based on a real business. I think sometimes when corporates make acquisitions, and Facebook has done this multiple times, Oculus, like we talked about, when they bought WhatsApp, that did not generate any revenue. It still generates very little revenue today. But I think there are strategic reasons and strategic values that sort of play into it. And so in some ways, I think that if Facebook sees CTRL-labs, they have this vision for what interface sort of holistically will look like in the future. There's definitely some value for Facebook in keeping that away from a Google or an Apple or a Microsoft, and quote unquote paying up maybe more than what seems realistic as a true value.
They seem to have taken a strategy with Oculus too. I mean, they paid $3 billion, was it, for Oculus? $2 billion?
Something like that, yeah.
And Oculus, I think, was, if I remember correctly, was substantially more nascent than CTRL-labs. It was a much smaller team when they paid. I guess I'm quotable on this, but I don't know that for a fact, but for whatever reason, I seem to think that's the case.
I think the team may have been smaller, but I do think they had, like, their DK product was out in the market. So they did have probably a real user base.
Got it.
Yeah.
Wow. Crazy, crazy stuff. Anything you guys want to finish up on before we move on to the next topic?
I mean, one thing I would just say that this wasn't surprising when I saw this. I mean, it was surprising that I was sitting at dinner with a friend and was like, holy crap, that just happened. But it's not surprising in that there's an article that the CTRL-labs CEO, Thomas Reardon, or an interview that he gave a while back. In fact, it must have been about a year ago, because I remember I was in San Diego for SFN last year when I was reading it. In fact, Ladan, I think you and I had breakfast when I had just read it. And Thomas Reardon basically was saying that he's previously built a product that's touched 1 billion people. He built Internet Explorer. And he's like, this building a product for 1 billion people is addicting. I want to do it again. And in order for what CTRL-labs was doing to actually have a reason to touch 1 billion people, it needed to be part of a full-blown platform. And the device itself wasn't going to be a full-blown platform. So it made a lot of sense for him to plug it into a company that's developing the full-blown platform to try and reach 1 billion plus people. So it makes sense to me just in terms of this little kernel of understanding I have about Reardon's motivations.
I would just say I think it's generally great, even though we're kind of saying it's not necessarily a pure neuro or BCI play. It's beyond that. I think it's still great for the broader industry because it certainly has a lot of components to deep tech. It leverages the sort of neuronal output in the motor neurons. So I just think it's a really positive thing to generate excitement about our industry. And I think, kind of the stuff with Elon Musk and Neuralink, which I know we want to talk about too, is another thing. So we've got some good tailwinds behind us.
I actually think there's one other thing that we haven't talked about here, which I think is important too, which is the impact of this acquisition on investments in neurotechnology. This was the first major exit in, you could generally say, in high-profile neurotechnology. And it was in some ways what I'll call a sexy exit as well. It was Facebook that bought it. It was a consumer technology that Facebook bought. And so I think what is going to happen is you will probably have a lot of VCs, a lot of investors who have maybe heard about neurotechnology, probably know what Neuralink is, but haven't really learned anything about it. They're probably going to be all of a sudden interested in it because that's sort of how venture capital works. It is a bit of a follow the leader sort of situation, but when everyone follows the leader, it's more like walk with the herd. And so I think there's going to be a lot of new interest in consumer neurotechnologies, which is going to be good and going to be bad. And I have some more elaborated thoughts cooking on this that I may write up at some point. But that's just another thing to watch out for is an increase in new capital to neurotechnology, capital that hasn't been exposed to this very unique field before. This field, as Doug has alluded to, has characteristics of deep tech, has characteristics of consumer technology. If you're doing a med device, it obviously has characteristics of a med device. And so there's a lot of weird angles to it. And then you have to situate it within neuroscience in general. And so it's a unique topology that there are going to be a lot of new investors exploring as a result of this. I think that's probably going to actually be the proxy through which this acquisition has the biggest impact on the field.
Yeah, that's a really good point for adding that. Yeah, so let's move on to the next topic, and this is Neuralink, as Doug mentioned. I think the entire Neurotech field was watching this, live stream. Well, actually, no, because I think in the US it was like at 1 a.m. or something like this.
I stayed up till 2:30 in the morning to watch that.
Jeez, that's crazy.
It was very worth it.
At that time, I was in Chiang Mai, Thailand, so it was a much more comfortable time or for me. And so I'll actually probably be giving an update on the podcast of what I've been up to lately. But yeah, I thought it was really cool, like really cool presentation. Finally good to have it come from behind the curtain, what they're doing, and it's no more hush-hush secret, So I thought that was very, very cool. And I have to say, I was very impressed by the tech. Basically, they have kind of these threads with electrodes on them, and then they have a robot that uses AI to void blood vessels and basically sew them into the brain. And they were talking, oh shoot, I forgot the channel numbers now, but it was something on the order of like 3,000, if I remember correctly. And so basically Elon Musk was saying, hey, this should be, automated. That shouldn't be based on the specialty of a surgeon. And it should be as easy as getting like a LASIK surgery. Everything's automated. Everything's kind of computer controlled. And you just kind of go in and have this done. So very, very cool stuff. I have to say, like, from my perspective, it was kind of the peak of like all the fields. Like Neurotech brings together like so many different fields. You got biology, chemistry, materials, all this kind of stuff. So I thought that was really kind of a dream team, kind of a dream design, which I was really, really impressed about. So how about you guys? What were your guys' impressions?
Doug, I've talked a lot. I'll pass the microphone to you for this one first.
Very excited. I think top line reaction. I think that, we're still a ways away from this being a reality. I know even, Elon kind of talked about that in speech. But I think what's interesting to see is, listening to him talk about how he thinks about the company. In my view, he seems to talk more about what he's trying to build with Neuralink as, this sort of hedge almost for humans interacting and living in a world where AI is more prevalent. And I think that's this really interesting viewpoint that can be kind of abstract and difficult for people that are new to the space to kind of embrace. Because the other side of brain-machine interface or brain-computer interfaces is the clinical side, actually curing, specific and acute symptoms or issues with the human body. And so, I think there's kind of those two schools of thought, I think are how we kind of, think about the invasive BCI space. And obviously we've invested in paradromics, and at paradromics, we're thinking about both sides of that coin. But I think the clinical side is a piece that is much more interesting in the nearer term. And I think, Musk's vision feels much more long-term.
The thing that I found most interesting about the whole presentation was actually less so the technology itself. And what I mean by that is, yeah, they had a bunch of money. They hired a bunch of very talented people. Clearly, they were going to develop something interesting. But the thing that I found most interesting through the whole presentation was their very particular use of the word aspirational. And I wrote about this a little bit. Their messaging was very clearly very crafted and on the top of mind of everyone. Neuralink started its public-facing existence through a 33,000 word article on Wait But Why. And that article, as Doug mentions, talks about neurotechnology as a ploy to save humanity. And it gets sort of pie in the sky and talks all the way about this, AI, neurological fusion, and new forms of consciousness. And I call it more of an interesting philosophical case study. And that for a while had been Neuralink's public-facing image. There was this idea of this grand thing. And all of a sudden, with this presentation, they literally said verbatim, this presentation is primarily about hiring. And in that same presentation, they were very focused on delineating between what the actual science and engineering work they had done was, and then what all the ideas they were kicking around about the future were. And I suspect that their hiring had been adversely impacted by some of the external messaging that they had done originally. And so this presentation to me felt more like a way to rein things in than a way to get the public excited. In fact, I'd call it honestly the opposite of getting the public excited. I'd call it make the public a little more muted.
That is very interesting, actually. Yeah, because everybody in the neurotech field, they got excited. Like everybody I've talked to, they're just like, wow, this is amazing. But I haven't, I guess, talked to people outside of the field so much or as nearly as much. And so maybe they weren't nearly as excited about it. Yeah, that's a very good theory. I think I think it's pretty legitimate, actually.
I think I would just add that it feels like both Avery's and my reaction, it might to the outsider seem that we're a little bit maybe, negative or cautious on Neuralink. I'm positive. I'm
jaded.
Yeah, no, and I want to make it clear, like I'm really excited about what they're doing. I think they have a really unique perspective. I think Elon has made it very clear, like how he thinks about existential threat to humanity. That's why he built Tesla. That's why he's building SpaceX, and that's why he's building Neuralink. I think he's trying to address these three potential threats that he sees in sort of global warming or energy, overcrowding, or sort of the end of a one planet living system, and then AI. And so I just think it's really inspirational to kind of see what he's trying to attack and do. But I think it's also careful that, there was, I think, some excitement around the media following the event. But I think it's important to realize that, Neuralink is one of the leaders in the field, but we're still a very long way away from having real product that's in humans or even being tested.
Definitely. And one thought I want to add here, which is a little bit of a tangent, but related. I talk to people who are in neuro across the spectrum from, mental health apps all the way to brain implants. And so you've got your mental health and you have your straight up consumer technologies and then your medical technologies. And generally, you see two types of motivations for being in neuro. Type number one is in medical, where you see people who are in neuro, at the end of the day, if you ask them to introspect and tell you, because they want to do good things for people. Maybe they know someone in their life who has a severe neurological or psychiatric disorder, and or they've just seen a lot of patients who've had this and they really want to do something positive. On the other end, you have consumer neuro, where my kind of frank assessment of it is that people think it's really cool, which I'm inclined to agree with. Neuro is cool. Neuralink is this weird combination in Elon's kind of humanity-saving version of it, where you get to do something good for humanity by working on something that's extremely cool. I'm always rather interested in motivations behind doing things, and so for me, just kind of looking at the set of reasons that people work on neurotechnology is something that I enjoy doing. And I figured I'd throw that out here just because Neuralink, with their messaging in particular, seems kind of unique in the motivation behind its existence.
And you guys know a good amount about actually the technology, the actual basis of all these things. So what's your guys' assessment of the actual nuts and bolts of what they're doing?
My assessment of the technology is generally echoes what I saw, on Neuro Twitter, for the big Neuro Twitter world that it is, which is the implantation seems really significant. The ability to try and minimize damage to the brain by taking a computational approach as opposed to thinking about it in terms of, or in addition to thinking about it in terms of materials approach, seems wise. The fact that it can be done efficiently also seems wise. I know that they did not discuss much about longevity of the technology, nor I don't know if they discussed much about the general biocompatibility of the technology. My take on it was that, yeah, there are open questions. I didn't get to a point where I was really overly thrilled with the tech, nor was I underwhelmed by the tech. The most interesting thing to me about the tech actually was what the experience is going to be for the end user. That is where it felt like the most meaningful innovation was actually going to come. I mean, there's certainly innovation on the neural interfacing side, and that's where the bulk of their science and engineering effort has been. But my lens to look at these things tends to have to be about the end user. as a function of me caring about these things as investments. And Neuralink is interesting in that they're a Silicon Valley company and they have Silicon Valley talent. They're taking a Silicon Valley approach of building this rather sexy user-facing application and a low-profile battery, and generally trying to build a nice experience around this. As I think you hear a lot about in neurotechnology, it's very bulky, cumbersome, belongs in a laboratory. And Neuralink is very actively and very clearly thinking about not doing that. And so for me, on the technology side, their ability to integrate their system, at least hypothetically, into an elegant Silicon Valley-esque consumer form factor and consumer experience for the patient, that is what I was most excited about.
I would only add or build on that and say, in some ways, I think what Avery's talking about ties back to what we were talking about with CTRL-labs earlier. And if you think about maybe the timeline of how to expect the interface with which you communicate digitally will change, right? We're very phone-based right now, and we're starting to pull in voice with digital assistants and things like that. The next frontier maybe is something related to AR, VR, and maybe CTRL-labs and input in some way that's more physical is that next frontier. And then beyond that, then I think you get into things like Neuralink or paradromics, where there's this sort of direct interface with the brain. So it's fun that kind of all of this stuff ties together in this concept of just interface of the future. And to Avery's point, I think how the consumer interacts with that interface, it has always been critical for the prior interfaces of PC and mobile, and it will definitely be critical for the future interfaces, whether they are kind of glasses or whatever in AR, VR, or the sort of direct connection, the direct port for Neuralink or paradromics.
And just to make this explicit, this is equally valid for neurotechnology in a medical context as it is neurotechnology in a consumer context. Neurotech in a medical context needs to be very usable for the patient, like absolutely critical. Ladan, I know that you know Ian Burkhart very well. Every time I talk to Ian, this comes up in conversation about how absolutely essential it is for a neurotechnology for a medical use case to actually be something that the user can use and that doesn't detract from their life.
Yeah, definitely. We don't nearly take into account the patient experiences, and it's just kind of like we build something like, oh, this is cool to have. So okay, maybe we can move on to the next topic, and this is maybe a little bit more personal for you guys, Loup Ventures, what you guys have been doing. So you've invested in Rune Labs. Do you want to talk about this, the reasoning for it, what it is, and bring everybody up to speed on this?
I would love to. So Rune Labs is a multitude of things. I think the biggest picture way to look at Rune Labs is it is a data management and analysis platform for psychiatric and neurological disorders, in particular for intracranial data sets. Rune was founded by Brian Pepin, the CEO. He comes from Berkeley, was at Verily for a while, and has quite a bit of experience in neuromodulation, and saw this problem whereby there are a lot of closed loop DBS systems coming to the market. For most situations, there is no standardized, easily usable way of actually working with the longitudinal high frequency data sets that are going to be coming from these closed loop DBS devices. And so that was, I think, the starting point for the problem as Brian sees it, is this need to equip researchers, med device manufacturers with effective ways to understand their data that they're getting so that they can actually use it to provide novel value to patients. And so that's what Brian's been working on to date, is a system basically for not only managing the experience of a patient and a physician in the context of, for example, Parkinson's. They released a patient-facing application called Strive PD, but also on the back end, pairing that data with the electrophysiology data. And by that data, I mean data about the patient and their treatment derived from the application, pairing that with the electrophysiology data, which gives you a labeled data set that researchers can now start to investigate using a nicely engineered software application that runs smoothly, cleans data automatically, labels things, gives you a host of visualization options. And so that is what Rune has been working on, is this software platform for DBS. And they've got some awesome early traction with it. The big picture long term, though, is as you have more and more of this intracranial data, you've got a basically ground truth data set about a host of neurological and psychiatric disorders that has never existed before. And given that, the brain is the substrate of the human existence and the substrate of these diseases, having fine-grained longitudinal data about the brain gives you a way to validate other signals that may be less invasive and less high fidelity. So, for example, if you had information about a patient's behavior over time and you wanted to try and deduce something about the patient's underlying disease state from that behavior, what you can do is you can use this brain data as an intermediary to validate some kind of digital biomarker, let's say, that you could derive from their behavior. And that's just one example of the types of the broader set of use cases that I think the data Brian's going to be able to collect is going to inform. And so that's this big picture for Rune, is being a data platform for intracranial data from the brain and using that data to enable other development of medical applications.
I think, in some ways, I can't add a ton to what Avery just said. I think he described Rune and what Brian's trying to build really well. The only additional thought I would add is just to thread it back to the last conversation, actually, about this idea of sort of usability. And if we believe that DBS is going to be this sort of profound space to address a lot of different clinical issues, creating products that researchers and doctors are able to use to effectively interact with the data that comes from those devices, I think is going to be critical. And I know when we first talked to Brian, we talked about how a lot of the data is managed today on like Dropbox and Excel spreadsheets. And it was almost insane to think about trying to manage effective processes using technology in such a hacky way. And I think what Rune's trying to do is really build a great sort of interface around how you can interact with that data, make it easier.
Is there anything else that we need to talk about? I mean, I think we did this last year pretty much, this kind of roundup, but I don't know, is there anything in this 2019 that you guys could think about to talk about?
I mean, just the biggest thing is to rehash a point I made with the CTRL-labs comment, which is I think there's going to be more capital in 2020 looking at neuro. So I think we're going to see more information about very young neuro startups that are all of a sudden capitalized and working hard. I think that's what's going to happen in 2020. There's going to be a lot more early stage neuro.
Interesting. How does that affect you guys, actually?
Well, in principle, it gives us a bigger pool of things to look at, which is always exciting. I mean, we are very much so benefited by more people being interested in neuro, whether it's through the lens of there just being more companies to look at and potentially invest in. And importantly, we're only part of the fundraise for the companies that we invest in. And you, of course, therefore need other investors to finish the fundraise. And so the more investors that know something about neuro and have an interest in it, proclivity to invest, the better for everyone. Better for us, better for the portfolio companies we have, better for the community.
Very cool. Love it, guys. Thank you so much for doing this. If you, the listener, has really enjoyed this, then Avery puts out periodic updates on what Loup Ventures is doing through his newsletter. I highly recommend checking this out. Is there anything else that you guys want to mention before we sign off?
Not at all. Maybe I'll give a plug for our Neurotech podcast. We put it out once every month or so. I usually post about it on LinkedIn. You can also shoot me an email and I'll gladly add you to the list. It's also available on our website. Ladan, maybe you could just drop the link into the description or something. But yeah, no, we call it the Loup Neurotech Podcast. Very creative name. It describes exactly what it is. It's we like to be direct and to the point. It's available on our website. You go to loupventures.com, you click categories, you click Neurotech, and then you'll see a list of everything we've done that involves Neurotech. So this is a combination of podcasts and also things that we've written and published. So yeah, if you want more of our take or our exploration in neuro, it's there and available for you.
I think Avery said it all. Nothing to add. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks, Ladan.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.